The United Nations hall was still. Cameras clicked. Murmurs echoed. But it was J.D. Vance who stood with stiff shoulders and sharp words. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. All he did was lift a single finger across the long wooden table and point it at Captain Ibrahim Traoré. "You," he said coldly, "are the reason these talks are failing." The room tensed. That one gesture cut through layers of protocol like a blade. Vance's face showed quiet contempt, the kind that didn't need to yell, but the implication behind that pointed finger was ancient, colonial, accusatory, imperial, and everyone felt it. Across the table, Traoré didn't flinch. He studied Vance with the patience of someone who had endured far worse, who had stared down military juntas, foreign-funded insurgencies, and economic sabotage. This was nothing new. But it was not going to be ignored. People around the room exchanged glances. African delegates sat up straighter. European ones whispered behind their hands. Even a few American aides shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone knew this wasn't just about policy, it was about dignity, and Vance had just violated it. The moment felt historic, like watching the opening line of a story that could either end in collapse, or change. And Traoré, calm as ever, reached for his mic. But before he spoke, his eyes scanned the crowd, not with fear, with clarity. He saw what many missed, how fragile Western arrogance had become, how close it was to cracking. The silence was thunderous now. And when Traoré finally leaned in, the world leaned with him. "You should be careful where you point that finger," he said slowly, his voice razor-sharp. "It might just show the world which empire is truly collapsing." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Vance blinked, but said nothing. For the first time in the meeting, he looked unsure. Traoré wasn't done. "This finger you point," he said, lifting his own hand, calm and deliberate. "It's the same gesture your ancestors used when they named slaves, when they redrew our borders, when they stole. But today, it points back at you." A pause. Then a single clap, and then another, until the room, once cold and diplomatic, began to shift. Traoré had just turned an insult into a revolution. The applause faded, but the tension stayed. J.D. Vance sat back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to regain composure. But something in the room had shifted. The American delegation, once radiating smug confidence, now wore a collective unease. Traoré hadn't just responded, he had reversed the weight of centuries in a single sentence. And he wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, hands folded, and locked eyes with Vance. "You claim we don't belong here," he said. "But let me ask you, where is here, exactly?" Vance didn't respond. "This hall?" Traoré continued. "Built on promises your leaders broke, decorated with peace that your bombs undo, lit with the hopes of nations your corporations drained." You could hear a pin drop. He scanned the crowd again, not just diplomats now, but the cameras, the journalists, the millions watching live around the world. "We belong here," he said, tapping the table, "because our people are tired of begging for a seat. Now, we build the table." The tension had turned electric. "And you?" he said, now returning his gaze to Vance. "You come with rehearsed accusations. You point fingers while your hands drip with oil and ash." Vance tried to interrupt, but Traoré raised a single hand, and the room fell still once more. "No," he said quietly. "Not this time. You've spoken for decades, for centuries. Now you listen." The audience, American and non-American alike, shifted uncomfortably. But not out of outrage, out of realization. "This," Traoré said, rising slowly from his seat, "is not just about Gaza, or Africa, or the global south. This is about truth. And your truth has expired." He turned to the African delegation behind him, nodding. "We are no longer shadows in your empires," he said. "We are suns rising on our own." And with that, he sat down again. Silence. Until this time, it was not the African delegates who clapped first, but a journalist in the press box. Then a South American diplomat. Then a wave of support, unofficial, unprompted, and unstoppable. Vance looked around, jaw clenched, but there was nothing to say, nothing to do. The finger he had pointed hours ago now felt like a loaded weapon, one that had backfired. And Traoré? He simply folded his hands again and waited. Because the next question wasn't if the world would change. It was who would survive that change. By the time the next delegate rose to speak, the air in the chamber had completely transformed. Gone was the stale predictability of scripted speeches and ceremonial applause. In its place, raw uncertainty, a tremor in the routine, the sound of something ancient, cracking. Ibrahim Traoré hadn't just silenced J.D. Vance. He had disrupted the choreography of global power, and everyone felt it. Even the translators hesitated, double-checking his words before relaying them. Even the security guards, usually stoic, exchanged glances. Even the American camera crews, trained to focus only on their own, couldn't stop panning back to Traoré. What had they just witnessed? A moment that shouldn't have happened, and yet, it had. While other leaders fiddled with their notes, pretending not to have heard, Traoré remained still. His presence was now the reference point in the room, like gravity itself had shifted toward him. Then a whisper began to spread across the chamber. From African envoys to Caribbean nations, from Southeast Asian observers to Latin American delegations. One phrase, passed in a dozen languages. He said what we couldn't. Traoré had spoken the unspoken, dared to call out hypocrisy not with rage, but with precision. And that made it more dangerous. Vance, meanwhile, sat frozen, no longer the loud voice of defiance, but a man exposed under a spotlight he hadn't expected. A senator out of sync with the new rhythm, and in that stillness, Traoré leaned slightly toward his aide and asked quietly, "Did you see his hand shake?" The aide nodded. "He wasn't ready," Traoré said. "They never are." The hall's silence was broken again, not by words, but by energy. Nations long pushed to the sidelines were finding posture, backbone, direction. This wasn't a symbolic shift. It was tactical. For the first time in decades, African nations were not asking for permission to speak. They were issuing notice. The era of silence was over. Traoré leaned back and looked at the UN emblem behind the podium. So many promises had been made beneath that symbol, and so few had been kept. But maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. After the session adjourned, corridors that once echoed with diplomatic small talk now buzzed with a different tension. Staffers whispered. Diplomats avoided eye contact. But some, those long ignored, walked taller. Traoré had not just spoken truth, he had revealed a fracture. J.D. Vance disappeared quickly from the main floor, escorted by aides with tight jaws and forced smiles. The cameras tried to catch him, but he moved like a man dodging something heavier than criticism, consequences. Meanwhile, Traoré walked calmly through the marble halls, his stride purposeful, unshaken. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than the polished shoes of presidents who had rushed past African delegations for years. Inside a private lounge, a group of Western strategists huddled around a monitor. "What the hell was that?" one snapped, pointing at the replay of Traoré's speech. Another shrugged. "That wasn't a speech. That was a warning. He's not just talking. He's shifting alliances. He's daring others to follow." And indeed, in rooms away from the spotlight, ministers from Ghana, Bolivia, Indonesia, and even Turkey began making quiet calls, to Ouagadougou. To Traoré's circle, to each other, not to ask what had happened, but to ask what happens next. The rules had changed, and they all knew it. Across the city, American media debated the incident. Some called it a breach of decorum. Others tried to downplay it, but none could ignore the viral footage now sweeping across social media, J.D. Vance pointing a finger, and Traoré making him lower it without raising his voice. The contrast was too stark. A self-declared superpower, silenced by the calm defiance of a soldier from a nation it once overlooked. In a dimly lit bar near the UN, a young political science student watched the clip on repeat and muttered, "This is going to be in textbooks." Because the real story wasn't just about Vance or Traoré, it was about a shift, a continent finding its voice. And a world struggling to understand that the age of quiet submission was ending. That night, the skyline of New York glittered like always. But inside the African delegation's residence, the lights stayed dim. Not from defeat, but from deep strategy. Traoré sat alone for a moment, overlooking the city. The hum of traffic below was distant, like the murmurs of an empire unaware its time was slipping. On the desk beside him, a folder marked with the seal of the African Union. Inside were proposals, not for aid, not for permission, but for partnership, real partnership. Earlier that day, a brief message had arrived from a South American ambassador: "Thank you. We've waited decades for someone to say it." Another, from Asia: "He needed to be challenged. You spoke for more than just Africa." Traoré smiled, not from pride, but from confirmation. The message was spreading. Across the world, in diplomatic lounges and university halls, people were no longer asking why he stood up to J.D. Vance. They were asking how they hadn't seen it coming. Meanwhile, Vance remained silent. His team released no statements. Conservative media tried spinning the narrative, calling Traoré disrespectful, emotional, overreaching. But those words rang hollow against the backdrop of Vance's own condescending finger point, replayed in slow motion. And the silence from the White House? Deafening. Inside the UN, conversations turned colder. Delegates looked over their shoulders. Because now, it wasn't just about speeches, it was about allegiances. Who would side with the West? Who would dare stand with Africa? Traoré's words had cracked the marble facade of global politics. Beneath it, everyone could see what had always been hidden: the arrogance, the exploitation, the unspoken rules written by empires for the benefit of empires. But no more. The silence wasn't peace. It was pressure. It was the hush before a rising tide. And everyone, every president, every ambassador, every corporate donor, could feel it in their bones. Traoré had lit a fuse. Now, the world held its breath. While Traoré's words echoed across continents, back in Washington, chaos was quietly unfolding behind closed doors. In a high-security room beneath the Capitol, members of the Senate Intelligence Committee were gathered, not to talk about China, Russia, or Iran, but about him. Ibrahim Traoré. "He's not just a populist," one senator snapped. "He's a threat to the global order we've maintained since the Cold War." J.D. Vance sat quietly at the head of the table, nursing a bruise that wasn't visible but felt deeply, his ego, cracked open on the world stage. "He turned you into a meme," one staffer muttered, not realizing his mic was still live. But Vance didn't respond. His mind replayed Traoré's voice in that room, that unshakable calm. That chilling phrase: "The world was never yours to lead. Just borrowed pieces from stolen lands." The Department of State proposed a charm offensive: invite Traoré to Washington, roll out the red carpet, flatter his ambitions, and slowly bring him into the fold. Classic diplomacy. The Pentagon wasn't so subtle. Satellite footage of Burkina Faso was requested. Files marked "containment strategy" were drafted. In New York, Traoré sensed the shift in tone. He could feel the chill of history trying to reassert itself. The same old empire, in a newer suit, still believing it could bribe, threaten, or manipulate its way into Africa's soul. But this time, the continent had learned. Africa had seen what happened to leaders who bowed too soon and stood too late. And Traoré? He wasn't playing defense. He was preparing for the next strike, not with missiles or militias, but with alliances. With dignity, with truth. So when an anonymous leak hit the media, revealing that the U.S. was exploring options to manage the Traoré problem, the public didn't recoil. They rallied. Across TikTok, Instagram, and late-night television, Traoré's name wasn't fading, it was roaring. Because you can smear a man's name, but you can't smear a movement once it's born. The following morning, the lobby of a Manhattan hotel became the stage for an unscripted showdown. The press had gathered for what they believed would be a photo op, a handshake between J.D. Vance and Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A forced gesture of diplomacy. But the air was electric. Something was off. Vance arrived first, grinning for the cameras, sharp in a navy suit, flanked by aides. Traoré followed moments later, calm, poised, eyes scanning the room not for threats, but for intentions. His uniform contrasted with Vance's tailored image, but it wasn't the clothes people noticed. It was the energy. They shook hands. Flashbulbs exploded. But just beneath the gesture, their fingers gripped tighter than protocol required. "Smile," Vance muttered through clenched teeth, "you're in the land of the free." Traoré didn't flinch. He leaned in, his voice low enough that only Vance could hear it. "Your freedom was built on chains. And we haven't forgotten." Vance's jaw tightened. His smile, plastic as ever, cracked for just a second. And then it happened. A reporter shouted a question, "Mr. Traoré, do you trust the U.S. government?" Without missing a beat, Traoré turned to the cameras. "I trust people. Not empires." The room went dead silent. For a second, even Vance looked stunned. That line, delivered with the weight of a continent's memory, rippled across live broadcasts. Social media lit up. "Who is this man?" trended on Twitter. Fox News ran the moment with concern. MSNBC called it a rare display of moral clarity. Vance, now visibly sweating, whispered to an aide, "We need control back. Now." But control had already slipped through their fingers. In that one moment, with one sentence, Traoré reminded the world that the old games of Western dominance were no longer being played by old rules. And as the press followed him out the door, it was clear, Traoré wasn't just commanding attention, he was commanding the narrative. Later that evening, Traoré appeared as a surprise guest at a Columbia University panel on post-colonialism and resource sovereignty. The event was packed with students, academics, and diplomats. Most were there for theory. They got a lesson in reality. When Traoré took the mic, the room leaned in, literally. No script. No notes. Just truth. "They taught us to call ourselves developing nations," he began. But what they really meant was dependent. Dependent on aid, on loans, on permission. That era is over. He walked across the stage with the confidence of someone who had outgrown fear. "They say Africa needs America. But it's America who needs Africa's cobalt for its electric cars. It's gold to back financial illusions. It's people for moral redemption." Murmurs turned into applause. Cameras streamed live. TikToks clipped every word. And then, his tone shifted, colder, direct. "Let me be clear, if any foreign power attempts to undermine our sovereignty through corporations, proxies, or puppets, they will not face speeches. They will face resistance." The crowd erupted. Cheers, whistles, standing ovation. But not everyone clapped. In a shadowy row near the back, a man in a dark suit silently exited the auditorium, phone pressed to his ear. CIA? State Department? It didn't matter. Traoré saw him. He smiled. Let them listen. This wasn't just a speech, it was a doctrine. A warning. A declaration. As the students chanted his name, Traoré. Traoré. He raised a fist, not as a populist, but as a sentinel. From New York to Nairobi, from Paris to Pretoria, the message was clear. Africa would no longer whisper. It would roar. The next morning, headlines blazed across continents. NYT, Traoré redefines sovereignty at Columbia. Al Jazeera, the African lion roars in the American den. Fox News, African leader threatens U.S. interests on U.S. soil. But Traoré wasn't reading headlines. He was walking into a closed-door session at the UN, one where no cameras were allowed. Across the table sat J.D. Vance again, this time flanked by advisors, intelligence reps, and economic strategists. The State Department wanted to de-escalate. Traoré didn't sit. "I came here to make one thing clear," he said, locking eyes with Vance. Burkina Faso will not bend to coercion, corporate bribes, or colonial dreams dressed as diplomacy. Vance tried to lean in, hands steepled like a professor ready to lecture. Captain, we both know isolation isn't sustainable. Your economy, your infrastructure. My dignity is not up for trade, Traoré cut in, voice steel. And your sanctions? Keep them. We're building new roads with new friends. You mean China? One aide interjected, eyes narrowing. Traoré smiled. I mean Africa. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Vance rose, walked over, and tried to lower the tension. Let's be honest, Captain. You're popular now. But we've seen what happens to leaders like you when the spotlight fades. Traoré didn't blink. I don't need your spotlight. I have my people. The silence returned, heavier now. Vance's smirk faded. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a showdown. And the world was watching, even if the cameras weren't. Traoré turned, walked out without shaking a single hand. Behind him, the Americans sat frozen, already typing memos. Strategies. Retaliations. But none of it would matter. Because Traoré had drawn a line in the sand. And dared the empire to cross it. 3 days later, something unexpected happened. The Pentagon's official channels went silent. The State Department cancelled a scheduled press conference regarding African developments. And on Capitol Hill, J.D. Vance avoided every reporter's question that began with one name, Traoré. Because somewhere in that silence, America had done the unthinkable. They blinked. In Ouagadougou, a celebration was already underway. Children marched through the streets with cardboard shields and painted flags. Artists filled walls with murals of Traoré standing unshaken before world powers. In a time of global fatigue, his defiance had sparked something rare, hope. But Traoré was not celebrating. He was in a small military briefing room, surrounded by local leaders, not generals in medals, but farmers, engineers, and teachers. They weren't planning parades. They were planning clinics. Dams. Internet access. This was Traoré's victory lap. Not in speeches. In solutions. When a young reporter finally reached him and asked, "How does it feel to outmaneuver the U.S.?" He shook his head. "I didn't outmaneuver anyone," he said. "I just refused to kneel." "And J.D. Vance?" the reporter asked. Traoré looked straight into the camera lens. "Tell him Burkina Faso is done whispering. If he speaks again, we'll answer louder." The next morning, U.S. officials released a vague statement about mutual respect and future cooperation. But it was too late. The world had already picked its headline. The empire threatened. Traoré laughed. And Africa awoke.